Um, I'm an assistant professor in the economics department at UNM. And then in my research, I do a lot of focus on energy economics, looking at how climate policies induce incentives to invest in renewable sources, and both at the utility level and also at the residential level. And I also work on a lot of the project sponsored by DOE that's started from New Mexico Tech that's looking at the economic impact of energy transition projects, for example, carbon capture and storage on the local communities. So in this part of the presentation, I want to focus the discussion on the equity consideration of renewable energy transition, specifically in the residential sector. So why do we care about the equity consideration? Because now in New Mexico, we're in a very unique situation that we have a lot of natural resources. We're abundant in solar and wind and also geothermal, but we are also historically reliant on oil and gas, right? So about 25 to 30% of the state tax revenue comes from the oil and gas industry. But we're also a majority minority state, having about 50% of the population being Hispanic, 11% being Native American. So we are in a very unique situation across all of the US and maybe even across the globe to look at energy transition specifically. So taking into the equity consideration is especially important to look at the equity in access, adoption, and also distribution of the benefits. So in terms of residential solar, I want to quickly ask, do any of you have solar panels on your rooftop? I think then you're among the 6% of the household within New Mexico that has solar panel adoption. So the state, as part of the ETA, which is the Energy Transition Act, the state does put into a lot of incentive to induce residential solar take-up. So on top of the federal tax credit, which is 30% of your total cost of installing solar, the state also provides 10% state tax credit for your total solar cost. But in addition to that, they also have property tax exemption, sales tax exemption, and also utility net metering, which means that all of your solar generation will be valued at the retail price of electricity. So given this, all these incentives in place, and also, as Bob already mentioned, the reduction in solar prices over the years, we see a huge uptake of solar PV starting from 2000s. And that's partly contributed to the fact that solar price has decreased over time, but it's also benefiting from a lot of the state tax incentives that I mentioned about. Although we have a huge uptake of solar, but we can see, given this spatial distribution, that it is unevenly distributed across different parts of New Mexico. So this is showing the solar adoption counts by per 1,000 people in different counties of New Mexico, right? So we can see, obviously, so we're here, somewhere in here. So it's concentrated in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Los Alamos, some also in Socorro, and also in Las Cruces. And then in the rural areas, there's, of course, lower take-up, but this is accounting for population density. And if we also look at the community considered as the Justice 40 community, so these are overburdened or underserved communities, typically energy communities as defined by the Justice 40 initiative passed by the Biden administration, we see that there's very few systems. So these are the orange ones lies within the Justice 40 communities, and only 26% of the systems are in these communities, but 86% of the population in New Mexico resides in these communities. So taking these looking at these figures, you can see that there is obviously some form of inequity in adoption of solar panels. If we look at the income distribution, so here we have area median income of the different census tracts in New Mexico, and these are the number of uptakes within these census tracts. There's a positive correlation, which says the richer the area, the more adoption of solar per 1,000 population. So also accounting for population density. And then if we look at the income quintiles, then the top income quintile would have a much 6 times more adoption of solar PV than the lowest income quintile. I mentioned before that the state's tax incentive is pretty generous in terms of supporting and incentivizing residential solar uptake. But we do see that there are significant amount of systems that do not take advantage of these incentives, which are shown by the orange bars, where the total length of the bars are the total installation within a year. And then if we look at the income distribution of taking up the state incentives, then again, in the top income quintile, at least 50% of the system claim these credit, but then in the bottom income quintile, it's only 25%. So this again creates some kind of inequality in distribution of these government subsidies that is still taken up by household that are already affluent in terms of having a higher income, higher education, etc., compared to where we actually want these incentives to go to the marginal kind of adopters who would not have adopted these systems without these subsidies. So that again, these stories, although it's descriptive, it shows some kind of trend in terms of inequality in distribution. So we want to think about that when we're planning for a heavy energy transition or when we're designing policy incentives, how we can structure these incentives to actually help the people that we really need to help and also help the transition, especially among the more vulnerable population that we want to help them move away from the reliant on coal or fossil fuel and move towards more renewables.